maybe politics is about personal preferences, as in, do you prefer one state or two states, or I think in this case they added on 0 states. In fact, politics is not about personal preferences, it's about what's politically feasible at any given moment in time. Now, it's true that there are a range of possibilities of what's feasible. And then the object obviously is to figure out what's the maximum that's possible, the maximum that's feasible, and to work towards that goal. And that brings the obvious question, which I think ought to be the question we're asking this afternoon, namely, how do you calculate this limit of the possible? What is the basis for deciding that one goal is politically possible, but another goal is politically not possible? So let's start with some basic premises. Number one, it should be obvious that Palestinians on their own, they cannot force Israel's hand. Now, it is true that the mass mobilization of Palestinians in the occupied territory is a necessary condition to force Israel, and in fact, in my opinion, it's the critical condition. In the absence of a mass mobilization of Palestinians, nothing is going to happen. On the other hand, it's not a sufficient condition. So let's take an obvious hypothetical. If Palestinians were now to engage in mass nonviolent civil disobedience, in the absence of international support, the most likely outcome would be that Israel will use indiscriminate repression to crush it. So that's why a solidarity movement exists. If Palestinians could do it on their own, presumably none of us would be here today. That's the first premise. The second is, there's a broad consensus that in order to reach public opinion, both at the level of states and also at the popular level, that international law constitutes a powerful weapon. So during the negotiations between the Israelis and Palestinians in Annapolis, the 2008 negotiations, at one point, one of the Palestinian delegates, he said, and now I'm quoting him, the key is international law, our biggest card. If you look at the other end of the Palestinian political spectrum, the BDS movement, a spokesperson for BDS, he reiterates over and over again in his publications that BDS is anchored in international law. Its foundation, its basis is international law. Well, if we're going to use international law as a weapon to rouse public opinion, both at the level of states and the level of people, we have to look at what does international law say about the question we're discussing this afternoon. And international law is very clear. It says there are two states, one already in existence, one to come into existence, in the area of historic Palestine, and that the border is the June 1967 border. So let's take a couple of examples. I'll take the examples based on the publications of BDS. So in 2005, BDS issued what's called a call. And it issued a call exactly 1 year after the 2004 advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. The advisory opinion that declared Israel's wall illegal. BDS called the ICJ advisory opinion historic and a legal and political watershed. Okay, we agree. International law is a powerful weapon, and when we're trying to judge what international law has to say on the topic, of course we're going to look at what the International Court of Justice has said. The concluding sentence of the ICJ opinion, the 2004 International Court of Justice opinion, to which BDS itself refers. The concluding sentence calls for, and now I'm quoting it, achieving as soon as possible, on the basis of international law, the establishment of a Palestinian state existing side by side with Israel. There's no talk about one state in the International Court of Justice opinion, which BDS refers. There's no equivocation. There's no ambiguity. There's no, so to speak, constructive ambiguity. There's perfect clarity. Two states based on international law. BDS also properly, I think, it refers to what it calls, quote, UN sanctioned rights, and, quote, UN conventions and principles that must be considered, listen to the word, the closest approximation to objective criteria to guide us in adjudicating conflicts of rights and freedoms. That's what BDS says. I think that's a correct statement. The resolutions of the General Assembly, the conventions, they're the closest approximation to objective criteria to guide us in adjudicating conflicts of rights and freedoms. So, what does the UN General Assembly say? Every year for the past 20 years, the UN General Assembly has been passing a resolution in November entitled Peaceful Settlement of the Palestine Question. And every year it passes the overwhelming majorities, the whole world on one side, the United States, Israel, and some Pacific atolls on the other side. And the resolution says every year, and now I'm quoting it, it reaffirms its commitment in accordance with international law to the two-state solution of Israel and Palestine. Once again, there's no ambiguity. There's no equivocation. We're going to say that we're going to use international law, and we're going to cite the United Nations as being the ultimate authority on what that international law constitutes. Okay, there's no debate about whether it's one state, two states, 0 states, or 10 states. It's right there in black and white every year in the UN General Assembly resolution. Probably the most respected PLO leader, the only one who I think died in recent years with his dignity and his credentials intact, was the Palestinian leader Shafiq al-Hud. And Shafiq al-Hud, in his memoir, which was recently published, he said, and now I'm quoting him, he said, once Palestinians elected to ground their struggle in what he called international legitimacy or international law, and in particular in the 1947 partition resolution, he said, well, like B follows A, the recognition of Israel necessarily followed. So let me quote him. He says, one could not just adopt one part of the partition resolution and aggregate another. It had to be taken as a whole. Which is perfectly obvious. Everybody in this room understands that when it comes to a law, you can't pick and choose. Once you decide that the law is your standard, you can't claim a right to walk at the green, but then say you're agnostic on the red. If you claim a right to walk at the green, then you also have an obligation to stop at the red. Or, as Shafiq al-Hud, I think correctly puts it, the law had to be taken as a whole. So now we're left with a puzzle. And I'm going to leave off at the puzzle, and hopefully in the course of time I'll bring in other issues, but I want to make sure I stay within my 10 minutes. If we agree that winning international support for the Palestinian cause is critical, And if we agree that international law is a critical weapon in winning such support, and if international law is unambiguous that Israel is a state and the solution of the conflict must be based on two states, and the obvious question is, how does one propose to win support for the Palestinian cause based on international law, yet not support two states? That just doesn't make any sense to me.
Good afternoon, brothers and sisters, comrades, the NSA. I do want to say one thing about this gathering. I feel very thankful to have been asked to participate. I do think it is a responsibility, however, of an internationalist left, especially coming from a country that uses Israel essentially as its Praetorian Guard in the Middle East, to highlight the voices of Palestinians in these discussions, and especially in a country that has done its best to silence these voices. And I'm very happy that Lamis Deek is here to participate in this discussion. I think the Left Forum needs to involve many more voices of Palestinians in talking about the resolution of this in the future. Perhaps as a follow me here, I'll take you on a little journey, but so it may not immediately appear where I'm going. But the other night I went to the opening of Dirty Wars, of Jeremy Scahill's brilliant film. It was sort of like being at the Oscars for the left, Jeremy's there, and Amy Goodman's there, and Flanders there, and Oliver, Stone pops in, and just the left together again at a brilliant film. And what I won't spoil it for you. It's a little depressing, but it actually is quite riveting, to be honest. It watches like a thriller. But one aspect of the film that is just simply riveting about it, especially for those of us here now in the 5th year of an Obama administration, is how absolutely unrelenting this film is on how Obama has not simply carried out the Bush policies, but actually extended them in what Ali Al-Nima likes to call a sort of remote control imperialism, a sort of drone warfare around the world. And yet we all know that there is not mass opposition, even to this. This program is widely supported in this country, to the tune some people measure of well over 3/4 of the American population is for the use of drones and the ongoing, sort of semi-wars that are just as deadly and just as miserable for the people on the receiving end of the drones as any other war and occupation could be. And yet there is no mass, organized, vocal, consistent movement countering that narrative and countering that on the ground in struggle or in language. And you contrast this with what is happening around the opinion around Israel, which stands out in terms of foreign policy as actually having lost a good deal of its support. And I want to cite from what is a useful book on this question by Norman Finkelstein. He's familiar with this. I'll cite from he says, if American Jews, and I agree, what did you say?
Unfortunately, he's the only one.
Yes, you should read your own books, Norman. If American Jews have grown more critical of Israel, this is a shitty platform. If American Jews have grown more critical of Israel, it's by and large not because Israel has become a qualitatively worse place. Untrue. Rather, it is because much more is now known about the record of Israel's interactions with its Arab neighbors. There is broad consensus on what the record shows. It is much more difficult to pretend not to know this record, and it is no longer possible to reconcile Israeli behavior documented in this record with core liberal values. And that's with a very true statement, I believe. If the romance of American Jews with Israel is coming to an end, it is because they now know too much. The question is why? What changed in these last few years? What changed is that a movement with a counter-narrative to the dominant reasoning, to AIPAC, to the American government, to every single newspaper's editorial board in the United States, rose up. And that movement is called the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Movement, which has had a transformative impact. I don't have time to turn this conversation into one on BDS, a movement that, unfortunately, Norman Finkelstein believes is filled with cultists, which basically means that all of Palestinian society is a cult. I don't believe he thinks that. I think it's a rather poor choice of words. to describe his book readership, people who listen to him around the world. As a forensic historian, his works are quite good. As political analysis, not so much. And I raise this because BDS is so central and has already shown itself, it's about to celebrate its 8th birthday, has already shown itself so central in countering the narrative and changing public opinion around the world, including in this country, including even in the pages of the New York Times, where just 3 months ago, many of us were bowled over to discover even the central question of the right of a Jewish state was questioned with the answer coming down and saying no. No, actually, you don't necessarily have a right to a theocratic police state. You know, that's not something we should necessarily defend in this country. And that is because of that movement. And I think this disconnect between ideas and theory and actual balance of class forces and social forces on the ground, and a movement that has politics, organization, and struggle, the 3 component parts that must come together in order for anything to change in society, is decisive. And I think it's what stands in the way of this question as well, which is why this isn't just a pot shot about his position on BDS, which I think is awful. But I think that it has to speak to this larger question that we're talking about today around a solution to Israel-Palestine. Because I think that, you know, when people say, and there's an excellent statement, people should read it. It was penned by Al-Awda NY and Omar Barghouti and Joseph Massad and many Palestinians, a few folks like Ilan Pape as well. They put together a statement called the One-State Solution, the One-State Declaration, excuse me, where I think they very much, in just a few sentences, coalesce what it is that is the problem with this notion of a quote-unquote 2-state solution. And they say the 2-state solution ignores the physical and political realities on the ground and presumes a false parity in power and moral claims between a colonized and occupied people on the one hand and a colonizing state military occupier on the other. It goes on to say, thus the 2-state solution condemns Palestinian citizens of Israel to permanent second-class citizen status, where their homeland in a racist state that denies their rights by enacting laws that privilege Jews constitutionally, legally, politically, socially, and culturally. Moreover, the 2-state solution denies Palestinian refugees their internationally recognized right of return. And goes on from there. There's nothing in the statement that I could disagree with in this declaration. I agree with you. And I think that we need to question how it is that why we have to understand that the notion that that many scholars and many Zionists, I believe Professor Finkelstein, I know is one of them, argue that equal rights would mean the end of Israel. We don't really have a disagreement with that. Those of us who defend the right of a democratic state for all in Israel, don't have a disagreement with that. We have a different interpretation of what that would mean. Because we basically only differ on whether or not it is a good or a bad thing. Because that statement implicitly acknowledges, by saying that, you know, that equal rights would mean the end of Israel, it implicitly acknowledges that inequality and discrimination are fundamental aspects of the state of Israel. No matter how you slice it. That is what that statement, that is how I can only understand that statement, which is why I am for, colloquially speaking, and I'll explain what I mean by that, for the sake of this discussion, for a democratic, secular state of all people in the area of Palestine. So yes, of course, the abolition of all laws privileging Jews. Of course, the freedom of movement and residency. The immediate destruction of the wall. The immediate destruction of the wall. The immediate destruction of the wall. You can't say it in enough time. It must be done. That is an obvious question. And the right of return for all Palestinians. But let's also not pretend. That this conversation is happening in a vacuum. Because when Professor Finkelstein argues that Palestinians on their own are not capable of resolving this question, they can resist, and have given a model of human capability of resisting under the most extraordinary odds, but nonetheless cannot resolve this question, is being utterly dispossessed of even jobs. And as you all know, as anyone who's ever been unemployed knows, if there is anything worse than being exploited by capitalism, it's not being exploited by capitalism. And so the ability to resist is an international question. And the way my comrade Moshe Machuber from Matzpen, the other International Socialist, Israeli Socialist organization formed back in the mid-century, no longer really exists, he puts it in a very important way. He tweaks this question of one state, two state. He said, it is pretty pointless to discuss the resolution of the Israel-Palestine conflict as though it would take place in an isolated Palestine box, whether partitioned or in one piece, while ignoring the rest of the region and failing to factor in its transformation, without which that resolution in any case is impossible. In other words, the Arab Spring, the Arab uprising, which I understand in this country, essentially began when Anderson Cooper arrived at Tahrir and ended when he got back to the studio. And for the people, the working class people in Egypt, that revolution continues. For the workers and for the people of Syria, that revolution is a dire question in their lives, whether or not they will survive or they will live another day. It is a question that is alive throughout that region, just as our solidarity movement internationally is a living one. And I'll end with this. I'll go in a minute or something. This question of realpolitik. I don't know what your banner would be. It's the politics of retreat. And it is, give me the status quo, I will tweet it. The question of realpolitik, by starting from the question of what can we do right now, I do not believe that any students, workers, and completely disenfranchised Egyptians ever would have sat down in Tahrir Square and occupied it to 18 days and thrown out a dictator if they started from the premise of, oh yes, we're going to go from zero to throwing out a dictator. It never would have happened. We wouldn't have had a black woman born into slavery in the early part of the 19th century start ferrying slaves north of the border. She lived to be 93, Harriet Tubman, and actually think that she could, raise a slave rebellion. And nobody would do any of these things. This is not a starting point for people of the left. And I'm not talking about dreamy idealism. The reality is that there's something called revolutionary realpolitik. There's actually a very good essay about it by Lukács. I won't cite him because he has very lengthy sentences that go into rather obscure language, but the reality of what he's trying to say is that it's not just theory over here and practice over here, there's a dialectical relationship between them, and that forces and ideas must come to combination. And that these little small movements that for years operated in isolation, having formed a coherent line, for example, in this case, BDS, can actually steamroll into a national, international, global movement that is now costing major corporations and the state of Israel billions and billions of dollars and their entire reputation on a global scale. I'll end here, we'll continue.
To explain how I think about this question, let me use an analogy of the living wage campaign. This is a campaign to get wages for low-paid workers on which they can live. Now imagine if somebody said, this is a bad campaign because the problem is capitalism, not the low wages that some employers pay. And I assume our answer would be, that's right, the problem is capitalism, but we can't end capitalism tomorrow. And if we say to low-paid workers, wait till capitalism is over and then you'll be able to eat, that doesn't make sense. That's not good politics. And it seems to me, someone might go on and say, okay, but it's really inequality that's the problem. Everybody should have equal wages. And I would say, yes, everybody should have equal wages. But again, if we demand that and leave it at that and say anything less is counter-revolutionary, compromising, just tweaking, a lot of people suffer. And one of the advantages of winning small victories is those kind of victories help you build a movement because people have the confidence of having won that lets you go on to further victories. Holding out for perfection doesn't work. Now, I'm not saying that it's always right to go for limited reforms. I'm saying make a judgment of what's possible under the circumstances. So in 1968, for example, it was right to denounce the CP unions who were willing to be bought off by small improvements when there was actually a chance to rattle the capitalist system. But when your judgment tells you that the best you can do is win $15 an hour, not a guarantee, but you might be able to win $15 in a living wage campaign, that's what you need to fight for. Let me turn now to the Israel-Palestine conflict. I assume we all agree on the following: that Israel committed a great crime against the Palestinian people in 1948, that the refugees have a right to return, that Israel is a highly discriminatory society, not just towards those it holds under occupation, but to its own Palestinian minority. Any settlement that ends the occupation alone and doesn't address those other problems will be unjust. But any settlement that addresses right of return, Palestinians in Israel, and in addition ends the occupation, that too will be unjust, because there are lots of other things that go into justice. We're socialists. How could a capitalist society be called just? So if you're calling for one state without saying a socialist state, you're saying, I'm calling for something that's unjust. But we do that all the time because we realize you can't have perfection. You do the kinds of improvements you think you can make. Any settlement that only ends the occupation, ends discrimination against Palestinians in Israel, and implements the right of return will be unjust. Any settlement that settles for, and this is what Machover actually meant, I think, any settlement that says you solve it in historic Palestine rather than turning the whole region into a socialist federation is unjust. But the question for us isn't, is a two-state solution just? The question is it more just than what we've got? Does it move us on the path to justice? And is it more or less the best that we can get given the current circumstances? If there were some other solution that would be better, that we could get in the same kind of time frame, of course we should go for that. Now, let me specify that what I'm talking about here is a real two-state solution, not one of the Bantustan suggestions that come from a Netanyahu or an Obama or whatever. I'm talking about a real two-state solution. And the question is, does that provide justice? That's an improvement over the current level of justice. And is it something that is qualitatively more achievable than the alternatives? Okay, so first, does it improve the measure of justice? Well, it ends the occupation. That's an immense human benefit to people living under occupation. It certainly doesn't resolve the refugee question. But even if there is no right of return at all to Israel, having a Palestinian state would mean that some Palestinians, some refugees, the ones who are the most downtrodden in Lebanon, would have a place to go. Is that their full right? Absolutely not. But if you say to somebody, would you rather live in a place where you're not allowed to have a job or be able to go to a Palestinian state, they might indeed prefer that. And for us to say to them, no, you must hold out, that seems wrong. Two-state probably does very little for the Palestinians of Israel who suffer oppression and discrimination. But on the other hand, the levels of discrimination, the levels of oppression, tend to be greatest when national security threats can be raised and used as excuses. Those will be presumably less after one state, so there'll be some benefit there. But the main achievement of the two-state beyond the benefit to the people living under occupation is that we'll only get a two-state on the basis of a mass Palestinian protest movement, mass international support, measures of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. All these things together might get us a two-state. If they win, it shows that these things can work. If instead we say, just hold out for 50 years until the Zionist ideology has been defeated, I'm not sure people will say, wow, this is a good strategy. Okay, so the second question to ask is whether there is some more just settlement that could be achieved that's not significantly more difficult to achieve than a two-state. Now, I think any careful assessment of the matter will say it's going to be incredibly difficult to get a decent two-state solution. But it seems to me that it is exponentially more difficult to get a one-state solution. First is the question of the correlation of forces. Two-state solution has an international consensus behind it. Now, some say this international consensus is sort of phony, people don't really care about it. Maybe so, but no one cares about a one-state. The two-state solution has the support of international law. More importantly, no significant Palestinian political party or faction has adopted the one-state goal. Not Fatah, not Hamas, not Marwan Barghouti, Neither Israelis nor Palestinians support one state. Now you might want to dismiss Israeli opinion here, given their oppressor role, but the fact that Palestinians don't seems to be a pretty significant factor. We'll talk about that later. Okay, so why else is a two-state solution difficult? Well, Zionism is a racist ideology, and they want to own the world, or at least all of what they consider Eretz Israel, so they're going to fight very hard not to give it up. But they're obviously going to fight much harder to hold on to their Jewish state. Now, the fact that they're fighting much harder doesn't make it just that they're doing that. I don't believe there's any justice in the Jewish state. I think Jewish Israelis are entitled to national rights, but national rights can be realized in a binational state. But I'm talking now about which is more achievable. Is it more achievable to be able to get Palestinians to, get Israelis to give up conquests, or to give up their whole state? Okay, so let me finish up by one other point. Some people suggest that the problem with a two-state is that it gives up on the right of return. The first point to make is that there's no logical connection. That is, you can have a two-state solution and have the right of return. Remember that General Assembly Resolution 194 was passed before the Israeli conquests of the West Bank and Gaza, East Jerusalem. So the expectation was right of return applied to Israel in its 1967 borders. Now, I'm not saying that Israel, in a two-state solution, will accept the right of return, but they won't accept it, and in addition, throw in their whole state as well. If you let right of return happen in two-state, Jews are probably still a majority, because you don't include Gaza, you don't include those Palestinians who are native to the West Bank. If you have a one-state, Jews are not a majority. Again, I don't think that's something that we should fight for, keep Jews as a majority, but in terms of what they're going to fight to the death for, makes that a very unrealistic proposal. It's like saying to a boss, we're going to go on strike until you give us the factory. The boss doesn't have a right to the factory, okay? But to say we're going to do it seems to me not a wise political strategy. Thanks.
I just want to say, I'd like to start off by saying that if we're framing this panel in the context of international law, and the International Court of Justice's opinion, well, we could see by looking at Palestine that the wall is not yet dismantled. And international law certainly has never been used as a tool other than primarily against occupied and third world nations. All that aside, what I'd also like us to consider is why we are not discussing birthright Israel. Why are we not discussing this unquestioned right of every Jew in the world to go and live on my land, in my home? That's what. And let's be clear that trying to complicate otherwise simple issues, right, of rights, let's say, does nothing more than dissuade people, push people away from looking at them in terms that are realistic. It was realistic for the people in Egypt to take to the streets and topple the government. If we had sat down and imagined all of these calculations, it would never have happened. But I digress. That's not what I wanted to talk about. I'd like to speak plainly. The only obstacle to peace, freedom, and the return of Palestinians is Israeli violence and colonialism. Period. The question before us is really, the question about one state or two state, is really a question about which type of violence and colonialism shall we tell the Palestinians that they must suffer? And the answer is none. The call for one state is neither radical nor utopian. And let me preface, I'm sorry, perhaps I'm a little passionate, I didn't start out with the jokes, but I happen to be the only Palestinian here. It's my home, my land, my people. Let's get used to angry Palestinian voices. voices being on the panel. The call for one state is neither radical nor utopian. It is acknowledgement of the realities on the ground, which require a recognition of two overarching themes. First, the open admission that Israel is not fighting for its survival. It's fighting for its privilege of dispossessing the Arab and the Palestinian people. It's the admission that the Israeli entity has absolutely no interest in a two-state solution. That is the reality. That it made that solution impossible, and even if it were logistically possible, okay, it can only secure its interest as remaining a majority Jewish state in a naturally Arab majority region only by the same means that it implements now, which is violence, apartheid, and expansion. Second, Palestinians, individually and collectively, will not actively or expressly disavow their rights or their lands, and they cannot be asked to do so as to privilege another population. But in this conversation, the Palestinians are not given a voice. They're spoken for to their exclusion. So the call for an integrated one state is the call also for the integration of the Jewish population, even the largely European Jewish population, into Palestine and the Arab world. It does not require the dismantlement of Jewish institutions, not at all. Certainly not the social and the religious, but it does require the demotion of their status as superior to the Arab natives in that area. And what that requires is decolonization by de-Zionization of Palestine. For example, can you imagine if during the civil rights movement, during the struggle, during the anti-segregation eras in the South, that while Jim Crow laws were being dismantled, you justified the safety of the white people by maintaining another institution to protect those very Jim Crow laws. That is the equivalent of what we are saying when we say we want a two-state solution. Because how does that majority get enforced, right? Whether it's in a two-state solution or in, this binational solution that a lot of people had proposed, and we didn't get into that much detail, but it's catching on, and I might have, toyed with it briefly. But even binationalism all presupposes this separation, and it's a separation that is not just from the Palestinian people, but it is a separation from the entirety of the Arab world. And it will entrench people in those identities and force them to behave around those identities in unnatural ways, and it will force whatever Jewish majority state that is to remain an ally fully dependent on Western imperialism, and therefore gutting, carving, and acting in the interests of Western imperialism in the Arab world, and a continuous threat to the Arab people. So anything less than a one-state solution with full reintegration is unacceptable. And I guarantee you that nobody sitting at this panel has gone to my hometown or any other area where my relatives live, or Jaffa, or any of the camps to see whether people want a one-state solution. Let's be clear, 2/3 of the Palestinian population lives outside the West Bank and Gaza. Also, talking about what is acceptable right now for interim purposes, for God's sake, let's look at Gaza. Is that the ceiling of our demands? That is the potential for a two-state solution. The alternative is, we can say that we will have these transitional models existing in Palestine during the transition into full reintegration in this one-state model. We can say, okay, we'll have some form of binationalism, but that depends first and foremost on the categorical admission of the injustices done to the Palestinian people, and on the exposure, the identification, the exposure, and the beginning of the deconstruction of political and economic Zionist institutions that exist to maintain the power structure which makes the Jewish population superior to those Arabs. We can have temporary transitional models that ensure transitional justice. That does not make it impossible, and I've yet to hear a single argument as to why, other than this unspoken elephant in the room. People have danced around it. I certainly haven't danced around my arguments for one state, but people have danced around it. So we need to consider, what is it that's being asked, right? Because it's not a matter of convenience. It's not a matter of what works now. We have 65 years of history to show us that temporary solutions, that asking for the least has been a failure, that 2 states, 0 states, nothing has worked, okay? So what is really being asked at this panel, right? And I'd like you to take, once again, look at this panel, right? I don't accuse anybody here of any ill will, but I do say that there is some sort of blindness, right? And it's a reflection of the colonial narrative, okay, as it relates to Palestine, the Zionist narrative. So let's kind of just view this a little differently. What are we asking? When we say 1 state or 2 state, when we ask the question, should there be, what we're really asking is, should the Jewish population of the Israeli entity retain their privilege or not? Should the Israeli entity continue to colonize Palestinians or not? And all of this is, in essence, the question of whether the Israeli entity should continue to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians or not. That's one frame of looking at these questions. But let's look at it from a different perspective, one we're not trained to do in this country, which is, and with all due respect, a more honest one, because we never asked these questions of the Algerian people with regards to French colonization, did we? And we certainly didn't engage that conversation, not only in the framework that's presented today, but in the framework that I just chose. The question would have been phrased as follows, okay? Are Palestinians entitled to live without apartheid and military occupation? That's the question that I challenge everybody in this room and on this panel to ask and to answer honestly for a change. Are Palestinians entitled to live in their own homes? And if that right exists, is it cast aside for the privilege of Jewish persons deciding to take that home? We need to talk honestly about it. These are the moral underpinnings, and we need to consider our role here. And I wanted to talk a little bit about de-Zionization, because the south of Lebanon was certainly not liberated by international law. With all due respect, I completely support the BDS movement, but it was not that which burgeoned the movement, re-burgeoned the movement in support of Palestinian liberation. It was the movements on the ground themselves. So we must support the Palestinian demands, and there are demands. 2/3 of the Palestinian population, very least refugees, will tell you they want to go home, and they can all go home only by displacing 10% at best of the population if they chose to do. Otherwise, Palestine is a big, beautiful, lush land. It can accommodate everybody. So we need to think about that, and we need to talk about de-Zionization. We're sitting here talking, and with all due respect, philosophizing, wonderful. We need to have these conversations. But I think when it comes to action, and this is a fantastic body, and I congratulate all of us on being part of building this movement, because it's all of our doing. But we need to have a conversation on what do we do next. Okay, we support the Palestinian call for self-determination and liberation and return, and we support BDS unequivocally. But are we confronting Zionism? Are we confronting the power structures that maintain the supremacist state of Israel atop Palestinian lands and the tools of its existence? And that's what we need to address. And there are many ways to do that in the US that we need to start thinking about. We need to identify what those institutions are. IJAN, International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network, is here. I mean, there are 300 plus private and other entities that operate inside the US whose sole purpose is to maintain the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, is to sustain that ethnic cleansing, right? So we need to start identifying them and talking about them in public.
There have been a number of allusions to the composition of the panel, and I certainly would have preferred a more varied panel, and I asked for one, and actually I was going to put the panel, unless there were a more varied one, but Palestinians declined to appear.
I'm a Palestinian.
He came in afterwards, and that was the one person, so I said, okay, I'll show up. But that wasn't my doing.
Does anyone else want to respond?
Yeah.
Yeah, go.
No, I know it's not coming through.
Yes, to report. Okay.
Yeah. I think the question, why did no one talk about birthright Israel? Why did no one talk about this aspect of Israeli domination or that aspect of Israeli domination? Because I don't know that there's any debate about that. There are lots of things we didn't talk about. The thing we disagree about is one state or two states, so that's the focus of, at least the focus of my comments. But, so I said at the beginning, here's what I assume we all agree on, and therefore don't have to make arguments about.
So, I was using that as an example of the framework within which these types of panels or conversations tend to happen. Certainly when, it's a discussion of one state or two state, so much is being left out, which is that I'm not saying that you necessarily don't, I'm not saying that you don't challenge the right of every Jew to go, but that's also implicit nonetheless. I mean, if I'm being intentional, it's implicit in saying that there should be this space that's reserved, that's carved out from Palestinian land, from Arab land, specifically and only for a Jewish population. That does not expressly say that, but that is the implication. And I think that that's a problem that's not being addressed. And I understand that your argument is the practicalities, with which I disagree, but that is also a part of the argument. To say that there is a need for a space assumes that there is a right for all of those people to live in that space.
I think Chair will respond.
Well, in some ways, it's an extension of this. I do want to know how Professors Finkelstein and Shalom respond to what I think Lamis essentially laid out fairly clearly. It seems from the presumption of the two-state argument that you're both in different ways posing it as if Israel is the result of some sort of national liberation movement of Jews and not a colonizing project, which is what it was and what it remains to this day. And that seems to lie behind this notion that this is acceptable to some. To some, it seems it's acceptable to other people who are starting with the presumption that colonization is okay, which is to say the Jewish population, and not the Palestinian population. So how do you both respond to that?
Well, the question is, how do I respond to the fact that Israel was a colonizing and still is a colonizing enterprise? I suppose my answer is, I could use the cliche and say, so is the United States was a colonizing enterprise. But I'm going to deny the cliche and try to speak directly to what seems to me speak directly to what seems to me the relevant question. And the relevant question is, are we going to try to speak consistently, or are we going to be hypocritical in the message we put forth to a broad public in order to try to build a movement? Now, on personal grounds, I personally prefer not to have to argue with the hypocrite, and I prefer not to be duplicitous, and I prefer not to be two-faced. As a personal matter, I prefer to be consistent. But the personal issue is not the important one, because for better or for worse, we live in something approximating democracy, and when we live in a democracy, the broad public doesn't hear one side, the broad public hears all sides. So they listen to the side of the Palestinians, they hear the East talk about rights. They hear, if you allow me to continue. They hear Lamis talk about Palestinian rights. They'll hear a discussion, they'll read the BDS material, they'll see it says we are a rights-based organization. They'll constantly hear Palestinians invoke international law. For example, every Palestinian invoked UN Resolution 194, the right of return. Palestinians will typically mention things like the International Court of Justice advisory opinion. The public hears that. But then the public goes, and they also hear the Israeli side. That's the nature of working living in a society. And the Israeli side says, well, wait a minute. They talk about all their rights, but what about our rights? We're a state. We're a state under international law. We're a member of the United Nations. As a member state of the United Nations, we have obligations and we have responsibilities, and we also have rights. So the public now hears both sides. And they go back and they ask Lamis, well, what about that? And then Lamis starts talking about the Israeli entity. Israel is not an entity under international law. Israel is a state. It has the same rights and the same obligations as the 190 other states. Now, you may say, I don't care if it's a state. So far as I'm concerned, it's an entity. Well, you're entitled to any opinion you want. Nobody bars anybody from having an opinion. That's not the issue. The issue is twofold. Number one, politics is not about personal opinions. Mahatma Gandhi, he didn't believe people should wear underwear, even over the Western galleons. But if he imposed not wearing underwear as a condition for being a member of the Indian Congress Party, politics is not about personal opinions. That's number one. But then there is a second issue. Then there is a second issue. And the second issue is, it's called being consistent. How can you constantly talk about Palestinian rights, which no doubt exist? How can you claim to be a rights-based organization, as BDS says it is, and not recognize that under international law, Israel has rights too? How do you do that? That doesn't make any sense to me. That's pure, unadulterated hypocrisy. And speaking personally, I don't want to have anything to do with it, and speaking politically, it won't go anywhere. It's very nice to sit in here and talk about the Israeli entity. Go out among a broad public and use that language, and you'll have 6 people in a phone booth to listen to it.
I'm not going to ask whether I can respond. I'm going to respond. First of all, I take objection, not offense, because it's not too hard to offend me, but I would certainly not be offended by somebody who holds the positions that Norman Finkelstein does. But I do strongly object to his attempts to try to personalize what is clearly an issue that touches not only the lives of 13 million other Palestinians, but almost 500 million other Arabs in the world. And that is very typical of the pattern of behavior that we've seen. I think it was George Orwell who said that ideas can, the most illogical, some ideas are so absurd that only, with all due respect, that only academics or intellectuals would agree to them. And I think that what's happened is that there's been so many leaps and bounds in this game of verbal and intellectual and logical gymnastics that we've managed to convince ourselves that there is some credence in saying that by advocating for a 2-state solution, that I am somehow being a one-state solution, that I am somehow being hypocritical or dishonest. So let me clarify my answer. States don't have rights. States are not people, right? Number one. Number two, I am under no obligation to operate strictly under the auspices or within the framework of international law, despite the fact that Professor Finkelstein or other professors would like me to do so, because they don't make that requirement of the Israeli entity that I do not and will not recognize. Period. I have that right. The Israeli entity does not have rights, certainly not when the conditions of its entry into the world stage, the legal conditions of its entry into the world stage as a quote-unquote state have all been violated or were violated within the first 10 months of its admission into the United Nations. So no, I do not and I will not recognize the right of the entity known as Israel to continue to murder and dispossess my people and to hunt me along with other Palestinian activists in the US. I do not recognize its right to do so. Sorry, I have to say, I'm confused as to why people who advocate for a 2-state solution, right, say that they stand for Palestinian rights, yet are constantly telling Palestinians what is right for them. I don't understand that. I haven't heard them say, let Palestinians lead, and with all due respect, what has led the Palestinian movement and made it expand is the work of
of people like Sherry, like myself, like the young students working in this room, and it was, again, international law never liberated an inch of Palestinian or Arab land from the Zionist entity. I had one last point, but I can't remember what it was. Oh yeah, so the right to return. You know, I remember Professor Finkelstein in 2006 at the height of the war on Lebanon saying that the implementation of the right to return would be like 60 million or 6 million or whatever million Chinese flooding into New York. I mean, talk about dishonest, inconsistent conclusions. These are things that were said. You know, attempts to inoculate political, militant Zionism from its political, militant history and normalize it as though this were just another manner of third world nationalism. I mean, these are dishonest attempts, and I don't question his ability as an intellectual. I do question his honesty in the conclusions that he makes. This is a manipulation, and I would urge that people be critical. I mean, there's great value to some of what he does, but what is he getting at, and what are his points? And the reason that I agreed to come here today is because this has been a point of concern for me for a long time, and I've seen students, especially young people, really buy into this little game, you know, and I think that that's what it is. For what purpose? I'm not quite sure. I'm not sure that he is either.
So I'm a professor, and that's often something to be very embarrassed about. But I refer to you as Miss Deek Esquire. You know,
I was quoting Orwell. I didn't make up that.
No, okay, well then Sherry did, right? Professor Finkelstein. Okay, look. I think Israel is a colonial settler state.
Please don't whisper.
I think Israel is a colonial settler state. I think capitalism is rotten. I think bosses are rotten. But I don't say to workers, stay out on strike until capitalism is over. Okay? Now, I'm not telling Palestinians what to do. What I'm saying is, I think there's a chance to achieve a two-state solution. Palestinian parties, Palestinian leaders seem to support the two-state solution. And I think I can pressure the United States government, I can pressure my friends and neighbors and people I come in contact with to make things easier for Palestinians so that when they have a mass movement, there's less repression, more likelihood that there's international support for them. If they can win one state, it's terrific. But if they don't want one state, and if people in the United States, not the people who are under occupation, say, as you're deciding for them, okay? No, the reason I say that is because you're sitting in the comfort of the United States.
But you realize you're doing the same thing. You're deciding for them too.
I'm not deciding. That's the point. I'm not deciding. I'm saying, what I'm saying is, I don't think that's achievable. If they can get it, great. I think it's ill-advised.
All right, but you can't blame me as a Palestinian for deciding what my people want, whereas you are doing the same thing and then blaming me for it. And you're not Palestinian. You have no direct interest in state. Do you understand? I mean, you're having a conversation. That's why I'm responding, because you're looking at me while you're talking, so I'm responding. It just doesn't make sense.
Open it up.
Does anyone finish responding?
Go ahead.
I'm going to make 3 points very quickly. The first is that I don't understand the whole basis of Norman Finkelstein's talk. BDS as a movement has explicitly made clear that it takes no view on the one-state, two-state, three-state, zero-state solutions. Individual members of that movement are free to express their own political views. BDS as such has not adopted such a statement. So where the inconsistency or the dishonesty is someplace else. It's certainly nowhere in any official BDS writing, as I think Professor Finkelstein knows, but is trying to basically, as we'd say, create an amalgam. Take one point of view, put it with another. Now, there's a long history of the one-state, sorry, my name is Amit Shalki, I'm from the region, over there. There's a long history of the one-state, two-state debate. The State of Israel was created, as everybody knows, by a UN declaration which, for a number of reasons, for their own reasons, the Soviet Union, the USSR, and the United States agreed to a two-state solution. That was the position of the Communist Party for a number of years, a disastrous position. I don't want to go into prehistory. The Palestinian movement absolutely did have a position on one-state, two-state. And over the period of the 1970s into the 1980s, as that debate raged, Palestinians were mowed down systematically and consistently, whether it be in the occupied territories or whether it was in Lebanon. Remember, the wars go outside of Israel and impacted the whole region. Many Palestinians came to accept a two-state solution as a necessary evil, and it took form in the Oslo Accords of 1988. Why are so many... 94. They began the negotiations. Forget it, I mean, it's so striking to me, because you want to see the reality. Is a two-state solution. That's the reality. Facts on the ground is that Israel will never allow, given the current structure of the entity or the state called Israel, will never allow anything more than a Bantustan. Which is why people who were for the negotiations, for a settlement, today say we were hoodwinked. And you know what we have? We have Gaza. We have a bunch of Bantustans and no future whatsoever. Last point, the Arab Spring gave us notice of one thing, which is that you could see it as a regional question, which is it's not just the state of Israel that the United States uses. The best allies are Saudi Arabia. Get rid of the Saudi chiefs and kings and monarchs of their Mubaraks and the rest of them, you can talk about a future. And yes, that may be like the tall order, but it is the only way that that region will ever be liberated.
First of all, a two-state solution is exclusionary, is racist, and structurally impossible at the end of the day. As the brother talked about with Finkelstein. But
That's just your preference.
no, it's not. But so at the beginning, you spoke a lot about these analogies, right? And it's very good for like a group of people to hear analogies because it sometimes simplifies the situation a little bit for us, which is so complex. But I think the analogies you used were completely incorrect. As Palestinians, we're in the negative right now. You made it sound like we have something, and we have something to gain with the two-state solution. As Palestinians, I'm Palestinian. Okay, I'm sure there's a couple other people here that are Palestinians who are speaking for Palestinians. So we're in the negative right now. As a two-state solution will only keep us more in the negative. Does that make sense? So I know probably this is the wrong group to talk about like this analogy, but look at it like an investment. Okay. Let's do the analogy. Give me a chance. So for the Palestinians, we have an investment right now. And even though right now it's not worth a lot, very soon Israel, the entity of Israel, is pushing itself farther and farther where our stock is going to be worth a lot. And Israel is holding on to an entity that is toxic. It's a toxic asset. And soon it's going to be worth nothing. Honestly, that's the truth. So a two-state solution is here's too much finance, but as a put call, you're trying to sell it before you lose too much. You're trying to, maximize your profits. I hope that analogy doesn't still makes sense.
They're clinging to the vestiges of what is failing.
Thanks.
First, when Dr. Finkelstein, and I think, I'm not sure whether you said too, you were talking about the fact that we should follow the international law because there is a sort of consensus there. What I'm wondering is that why we should go with 1967 or 1948 as the basis of international law and acceptance when we know that what United Nations had agreed to, that was their plan, was in 1947 and the area that was given to Israel was much smaller than the area that they forcefully acquired by actually mass murdering people, Palestinians, in several villages and in a town that recently the bones of those people have been discovered. Deir Yassin, I know someone is a survivor of Deir Yassin. So those patches of land were stolen. I'm not talking about just the whole Palestine, that's another issue. But if we go by international law, at least those patches of land are stolen land. They are not legal. That's my one question. Another thing is that I was hoping that someone would address this issue of some very strange bedfellows, basically, in Palestine. There are some Israeli settlers who have been arguing for a while, but they are marginalized. They've been arguing that their attachment is to the land, and they don't care under what kind of government they live. They want to live on the land. And this is basically what Palestinians want. Palestinians are attached to their olive trees. They are attached to their land. And again, there are some Palestinians who also follow these kind of arguments. Both groups are marginalized, but I think that if there is any solution, it is this kind of solution. States are arbitrary creations. Nations are arbitrary creations. What is real is the connection of people to the land. And I think that should be our guide toward creating a just peace in that area.
I think what you argue is very sentient, that there are people with a range. I don't understand why there's some attachment to sort of codifying, what Netanyahu says is somehow, generally speaking, is global opinion. I mean, the reality is, see, so much of what you are raising and so much of what has come up here is what is realistic. Well, what is realistic? Why is it somehow more realistic to say that a state that has obliterated the lives of literally millions of Palestinians that on a daily basis dispossesses them of any kind of dignity, of food, of water, of electricity, of anything, is somehow going to transform itself overnight through no de-Zionization process, because you're talking about a codification, a further codification of the Zionization process, that somehow that is going to be amount to a state in which Palestinians elect anything more significant than a dog catcher. I do believe that we have been watching the rollout of a two-state solution in slow motion for 20 years now, and this is what it looks like. It looks like barbed wire, it looks like checkpoints, it looks like starving Palestinians, and it looks like vast unemployment with no human rights. That's what we have. That's what we have. So I do not appreciate the sort of mischaracterization that any defiance of that status quo is somehow loopy, dreamy, living up on planet cuckoo. Otherwise, because basically, why are we here in a left forum? Let's just tweak the status quo, join the Democratic Party, and be done with it all. They don't call it struggle for nothing. It's kind of hard.
Two things about for one state. In South Africa, the white minority is 13%. And they instituted one person, one vote, fundamental democratic principle. And the 13% white minority still controls that society. They don't have the political leadership, but because they control the economy, they still run it. If you have a one state, that's not a guarantee of a decent society. Because you can still have a Jewish minority or slight majority domination of a one state. Some one-staters, to make it sound like this is really easy, have said, let's keep the settlers where they are. And some of the settlers that your question referred to are saying yes, and the reason they're saying yes, we would like, Moshe Ahrens and some of the settler leaders have said this kind of thing, because they believe that even with one person, one vote, we've got the security services, we've got these economic resources, we're going to control the state anyway. And so to say, let's have a one state and let the settlers stay, that seems to me really crazy. Now, I realize it's hard to get the settlers out. But you don't need to get the settlements, the buildings out, right? So to say that the West Bank is already got so many different groups interspersed and so you can't separate them out, no, you can very easily. Okay? You send the settlers home and you bring refugees from Lebanon and you put them in the housing. That seems to me easier to do. It's hard, right? Because the settlers are a powerful political lobby in Israel. Okay? But the Israeli population as a whole is an even more powerful political lobby. So if you can't defeat the political strength of 500,000 to 1 million settlers, how are you going to defeat the political strength of 7 million Israelis?
I think I'd like to continue with that logic, actually. So what the next logical conclusion to that would be that the status quo is the only possible reality of this. That was what would have followed. Because what was said, I'll get there. What was said was that if we can't defeat, or if we can't remove the settlers, or I don't remember what. I don't remember what was the last phrase that you said. But if we can't defeat the already very powerful settlers, then how would we be able to manage undoing the economic?
How can we defeat the whole state? In other words,
Yes, please.
to remove the settlers means you've got to defeat the political power of this very powerful lobby.
Okay.
To institute one state, assuming that they don't decide that they can control it, to defeat the power, to turn Israel into one state, you don't just have to defeat the political power of a 500,000 person lobby, you've got to defeat the political power of 7 million Zionists.
You've also got to defeat the power of 13 million Palestinians.
Well, they're there in either case.
Right. So which would not ensure the security of this majority Jewish population in a two-state solution. I'm just saying. I mean, we're moving forward. So your argument is that it's going to be hard enough to lobby to get the settlers to leave the West Bank, right? So why even imagine doing anything beyond that, right?
Talk about it. Talk
About
the
it,
rights, but you're not going to win.
This is a debate. It's a conversation.
I understand, but we have other people want
Oh, okay.
questions, that's all.
So I would beg to differ, because it's actually far more difficult to dismantle, right, the settler structures, and in fact, the very structures that support and proliferate the dispossession of the Palestinian people are the very same structures that also control the resources in Palestine. So if we are able to stop the settlements and the settlers and the idea of the settlements politically, economically, and so on, then we are equally able to dismantle the power structures that exist to dispossess the Palestinian people. A great organization that can deconstruct that in tangible terms is actually IJAN, who can trace where all the Zionist institutions operate and what they're responsible for. It's only a set number of organizations, many of which largely exist outside the Israeli entity, primarily in the US and Europe, which control, purchase, whether it's the water, and so on and so forth. So it's not an impossibility.
Okay.
Even if this idea of all these impossibilities, the alternative is the status quo. There is no other alternative. It's been almost 30 years of working towards a so-called two-state solution, and we have Gaza. We have Gaza under siege, period. That's the realistic, 10, 15 years ago, you couldn't talk about the one-state solution. Now, as far as Palestinian organizations and organizers go, you don't have legitimacy if you're not talking about one state. That's the reality. That's how movements work. I'll move on.
I am primarily a labor and LGBT activist, but I have been following this situation for quite some time. For many years, I believed that the two-state solution was the way to go. It seemed, abstractly, it seemed fair. You had two peoples, two states, you have equal sovereignties, etc. As long as it remained an abstraction, I didn't move from that. In the 20 years since Oslo, as both Amit Shaki and Terry Wolf have pointed out, that abstraction has become a reality on the ground, and that reality on the ground looks worse and worse all the time. What I'm concerned that a two-state solution will be sold to the United States and the world, which will be basically Bantustans or colonies. That's what we're talking about. In response to Steve Shalom about the realism of this, I traveled in South Africa in 1985 and 1986. At that time, I would hardly have believed that within 5 years, the apartheid government would actually yield power, and yet it did happen. It is true, indeed, that the white minority has retained social privilege to an extent that I also would not have quite believed. Nevertheless, it is also true that the past laws are gone. The repression by the South African military, although it has cropped up recently in the mine strikes and so forth, the whole police state apparatus has radically changed. I think that if you talk about incrementalism, that's the kind of incrementalism that that makes more sense. I believe that you cannot build a just solution on an ethnocratic state.
Is Israel a Jewish state or anything like a Jewish state? A Jewish state says, be good to the stranger, for you are strangers in a strange land. Do not cut the olive trees even in times. Do not cut the olive trees even in times of war. Do not, one of the big commandments, do not covet your neighbor's house or anything that is your neighbor. This Jewish state has usurped the quality of the Jewish ethics, civilization, culture, made it into a criminal conspiracy that has stolen the land. It must be given back what was taken. The vision only is people living together. People who want to live together should live together. People who don't should go somewhere else.
I thought I understood the occupation. I really did. I followed it for 40 years after I lived on a kibbutz in Israel and left because I recognized it as colonialism. That was back in '69.
What's your question, though?
My question is this. So I went there and I saw it. And it was much, much, much worse than anything I had expected. It is deep and profound, and the settlements are everywhere. The walls are everywhere. The question is this. Who in their right mind really thinks that Israel is going to dismantle all those settlements, pull down all those walls, rebuild all the Palestinian houses that have been demolished, and give up areas that basically they have stolen? Who really believes that Israel is going to do that?
Okay, this question to Professor Shalom and also everybody else. I think the two-state solution will generate more violence, even though it's possible, as you're suggesting that, this is the best we can get, but it will generate more violence. About one-state solution, I'm not very sure if it would manifest violence as well, but however, I argue that the state itself and its nature is violent, and it's a manifestation of violence. So if we will argue about having one state or two states, we are arguing the same thing, that we will encounter more violence and violence. However, I want to go back to the gentleman with the hat. He was saying that if people want to live together, then let them live together, and let the Western and the illegitimate international law and illegitimate UN stay out of it, and let people live how they lived before. Thousands of years ago, they just lived based in free agreement. So So I'm asking you, do you think that's a possibility of just rejecting the modern invention of states that divide people, that doesn't allow free agreement and mutual interest? Because for Israelis who are living in Israel and Palestinians who are living in Palestine and Arab, I am Egyptian, right? And I also want the region to be peaceful so we can live. So if you let these people have mutual agreement and you stay out of it, then we might have a future. But as long as you are imposing your Western colonization ideas on us, we will never reach peace. And so are you. You will never reach peace as well.
That's why I'm also a Palestinian. And I'm an Israeli, like Lamis Deek probably. I'm an American citizen, which is my current primary identity. Lamis Deek used to tell me like separation from the Arab region, threat to the Arab people. Naturally, Arab majority people of the region. And 500 million Arabs of the world. Making this a conflict with the Arab people. Not talking in the otherwise internationalist tone as many other people speak. If it is a struggle between the Jews and the Arabs, then so be it. Now the question is, and then what do you more do?
Sorry?
A question. If there are going to be two states, what are the mechanisms that are likely to bring it about? The likely mechanisms, and they're not going to be perfect. What are the possible boundaries that are likely to be the outcome? And obviously the boundaries to stand are unacceptable to anybody, but exact 67 line might not be the exact solution. And also, what will be the nature of another state as part of the state in Palestine? What is it likely to be? And what will be the nature of the one state? Not what you wish for. What are the likely outcomes?
I would like to address the question of realpolitik. Is it not impractical, politically unpragmatic for the solidarity movement to shy away from showing a firm, unwavering commitment to ethical principles, as opposed to accepting the terms of the debate that our enemies propose? If the U.S. or Israeli public disagrees with those principles, well, surely we have a mountain to climb that the colonizers have to be convinced to decolonize. But my question is, practically, does it not hurt our cause to throw our own commitment to those principles that we hold dear into doubt by compromising?
I just want to say this. It seems to me that analysis of the left forum, of all places, should start not from international law or the rights of the Israeli state, but with the rights of the oppressed. And oppressed people have rights whether or not they are recognized by any of these other institutions. The oppressed certainly never gave imperial powers to control the UN in 1947 the right to partition their land. Palestinians would be entitled to return even if Resolution 194 was rescinded. That's why you'd be hard-pressed, it seems to me today, to find Palestinians outside the Palestinian Authority to argue for a two-state solution, because let there be no confusion. A two-state solution means apartheid. It is not a form of justice, it is not a more limited aspect of justice, but rather a barrier to justice. It means, in practice, no equality for Palestinian citizens in 1948 Palestine because of the so-called demographic threat. It means no right of return for the 70% of Palestinians. No right of return for Palestinians, 70% of Palestinians who remain refugees. And it doesn't even mean against the 1967 occupation. And the final thing is this. I think I would do this question to the panel.
Let him finish.
I put this question to the panel. In regard to what other social movement would people be at the left forum be telling the oppressed what it is that they must surrender? Do they tell that to the Black Freedom Movement? Do they tell that to the South African anti-apartheid movement? Why is it that the only movement that people at the Left Forum, for example, would dare say this about Palestine. Okay, we're going to take
The reason why the two-state solution was adopted by the Palestinians was that it was seen as a negotiated surrender to Zionism in the 1970s and since then. And what I find puzzling by the people who bring up the one-state solution is the question of why they think that somehow now the balance of forces has changed, which I don't see. The other thing that I find puzzling about the one-state solution is that the people who bring it up are almost exclusively seem to be diaspora Palestinians, and they don't necessarily be that serious about it. I mean, I remember Al-Awda NY in Chicago. Okay, so the question isn't it the case that if you adopt the one-state solution, you would have to oppose a two-state solution? And isn't it the case that you would have to oppose both the PLO and Hamas, as well as the state of Israel, if you adopt the one-state approach?
Okay, so one short question.
There's a question put at the very end. Why is it that a leftist forum are we beginning with international law and not speaking in the first place about the oppressed? So let me try to address that question. First of all, I'll try as best as I can to steer clear of personal opinions about how I think the conflict should be resolved. People who can be pulled back as far as approximately 45 minutes ago might recall that I said, let's look at what the Palestinian movement itself has said. I called first on one end of the political spectrum the Palestinian Authority, which states that international law was their big part. I then looked at the other end of the Palestinian political spectrum, namely BDS, and if you read the BDS statements, some of which I've quoted this afternoon, they say clearly and unequivocally that they are anchored in international law. And then they begin their three-point program by saying that we are, quote, a rights-based organization. We are based in international law. Anybody here who's been active in the BDS must surely know that fact. So it's not me that began with international law. It's the full spectrum of the Palestinian movement that's been invoking recurrently international law. Now,
I'm sorry, I think we need to allow everyone to respond.
okay, so I'll just end this note. I do not personally, and I'll speak for myself and some 30 years of experience in that, I personally don't think that's a wrong starting point. I think there's a good reason why the full spectrum of the Palestinian movement has leaned on international law. It's because anybody who's tried to reach a public as against make rhetorical statements which sound good in a smaller room, anyone who's tried to actually reach a public realizes that's Israel's weak reed. That's Israel's chink in the armor. And so let me just end by quoting the 2008 negotiations. The main Israeli negotiator was then the foreign minister Tzipi Livni. And Tzipi Livni, at one point, she was faced with the Palestinian delegates who kept invoking international law. And at one point, she got very impatient, and she said, listen, I'm a lawyer. I know the law. I'm against law in general, and in particular, I'm against international law. That was not hypocrisy on Tzipi Livni's part. She recognized that all the critical issues bearing on the Israel-Palestine conflict, Israel is in conflict with international law.
I'm sorry, we're running.
So she cannot both defend the state of Israel, she was its foreign minister, and uphold international law. As the foreign minister, she knew she had to be against international law. It's very troubling to sit in a room and hear people who are in effect in the same camp as Tzipi Livni.
The earth is round. I'm not going to address that because it's a parallel universe comment. I want to say this because there's two things. Number one, I see no contradiction in a social movement raising international law, citing it, in order to point a finger at the hypocrisy of governments who what they say and what they pass in resolutions and what they do on the ground. And that's what the BDS movement is simply doing. It's not a shackle, it's a point of reality. I want to say something else that runs through this discussion, that principles, having principles, starting with the self-determination of the oppressed, which should be a starting point for every single person who is a leftist, certainly an internationalist, is some sort of hippy-dippy thing. There is not one social movement that you can point to in the history of this country, or I would dare say internationally, that has thrown out its principles, starting with anti-racism and confronting oppression of every sort, that has moved forward. It has always led to a divide and conquer. It has always led to a situation of chaos. Even in our own country, where we are all familiar with the labor movement has been revitalized in this country by what? A Chicago teachers' struggle that started with what? Fighting racism and stopping school closures in black and brown communities. And you know what they built? Massive solidarity and the most rousing strike that we've seen in decades in this country. And it started with principles, and not saying that these are hippy-dippy things that we can just sort of excuse, that we talk about in polite rooms, but we don't actually put in practice. And finally, I just think that we have to say this whole idea that realism is a rather fungible sort of plastic thing. Nothing is real until we make it real. Unions were illegal in this country until people broke the law and they made them real. The fact that a Jewish lesbian socialist is sitting here next to a Palestinian, nothing about this is all a social construction. If human beings build it, human beings can tear it down. And that's where we're part of the left, because we believe in transformation. So let's not start as our starting point with what kind of oppression can we allow for 11.2 million people to substantiate. Right. And frankly, the comment about only diasporic Palestinians have said this or that, you're talking about 70% of the Palestinian population. So as to say to people, your people were murdered, your people were exiled, your people were ethnically cleansed, now your opinion is of no consequence to us, is basically to say, I think nothing of the reality of self-determination and oppressed. That's our starting point, that has to be our ending point, which is why I'm for a single democratic state. Like, you know what? Jews and Palestinians live together in Brooklyn. Why would anybody defend that this is impossible? We live together.
That was fantastic. I almost don't want to go, and I was told that I had to go first, but I declined because I take many objections in and out of court. One issue that, when I came here, I actually had something completely different prepared. And that's because my sense of where the American left was might be a little off. And in fact, I find that outside American left circles, in places where people don't necessarily call themselves American left, there seems to be a more progressive, more open view to the one-state solution than in the circles that are considered American left. And that's something I'd like us to consider. Also, this idea I've been accused of being dogmatic. This was a 10-minute presentation and then a lot of going back and forth. But what I came here with was this kind of implementation and application of the one-state solution, which includes all of these phased in periods. And I encourage people to really start looking into that, because in the Arab world, despite what Mr. Shalom and Mr. Finkelstein have said, in the Arab world, these are the discussions that are being had. In Palestine, these are the discussions that are being had. In the refugee camps and in the diaspora, the questions are what type of state, and not whether it's one or two state. And we must make sure to not equate the fabricated, created, elite Palestinian quote-unquote leadership, which shares the same interests as does the Israeli government with Palestinian movement leadership. In fact, this very government, the Palestinian Authority, was not democratically elected and has also co-opted the voice of the PLO, and there is an international movement to reclaim the PLO. And Rahmatullah alayh, Shafiq al-Hud was an elder and a friend, and rest assured, he is somebody who advocated for the full return of every single Palestinian. His wife has published this massive book on the massacres and the return of the Palestinian refugees. And, this is not the age of defeat for the Arabs. You look at the Arab world. Anything is possible.
allowed for the continued proxy colonialism in the Arab world and have allowed for Israeli hegemony in the Arab world. We're seeing a strong counter-revolution against that, but we're also seeing people in the Arab world reclaiming their power. And when I say the Arab world, I don't mean this, Arab and Jew, because there are Arab Jews, and rest assured, Israel does not care to help Arab Jews articulate their Arabness. So when I say Arab, I'm referring to the Arab masses, not the Arab elites. And we have to, even as an internationalist movement, recognize that social justice, economic justice movements must also consider the racial or ethno-religious dynamics that are a reality. We can't ignore that fact. That there is, in fact, an attempt to distinguish the Jewish population from the Arab population. But no, I don't mean it in just an ethno-religious sense, but also in the broader 99% sense.
Somebody said you can't build a just solution on an ethnocentric, ethnocratic state. That's true. You can't build a just solution on a capitalist state. There are lots of ways in which we will not have just solutions in the short run. Because we're leftists, because we're socialists, we always talk about our principles. No, we don't give up our principles, but it doesn't mean that in limited struggles we don't sometimes have to accept less than our maximal position. That just seems to me what the real world is like. So, the Chicago teachers strike, they still have contracts. They still have some measures of assessing teachers through in some standardized tests, etc. They didn't win their full victory, but yet we cheer them.